Hey everybody, welcome back to another installment of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
What up, everybody? This is Nick Severi.
Oh, word up, everybody. Okay, what podcast is this? What did we got to do the NPR voices. People are not expecting.
Oh, here we go with this.
You're scaring everybody all of a sudden.
Sorry, not Anglo enough. My apologies. Let's try this. Let's try this again, Mike.
Yeah, how are you doing, my friend Nicholas? How's everything, man?
I'm doing very well. We use Dove soap over here. We keep it clean. I've got a beautiful white Chevrolet in the back. Kids are doing well. We've got golf practice coming up.
That's very well done. You're taking it extremely far, but yeah, that's very well done. I like that. It is, by the way, it is a scorcher out here. If you live in the Northeast, it is brutal around here. We just did our meteorology episode before. So weather patterns are coming across the country, but man, it is hot out there in the Northeast. Speaking of what's hot, because politics right now is on fire. I was reading an article the other day on Politico about obviously what's going on with the Trump organization and the grand jury subpoena. And then I was flipping around the dial and watching something on the voting rights legislation that's being passed in the different states in Georgia, Arizona, Texas. And one person just kind of kept coming up in some of these circles. I was like, I got to talk to this person because she is everywhere. And so our guest for today is the fabulous Kim Wehle. Kim Wehle is a university professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She is a frequent contributor, to the bulwark.com, to Politico, like I mentioned, The Hill. You've seen her on CNN, MSNBC. She was formerly a legal analyst on CBS News. She was a former assistant U.S. attorney. And she's also written some fantastic books that I highly recommend for people out there that really want to get civically engaged. There's two of them, specifically one called How to Read the Constitution and Why. And the other one is What You Need to Know About Voting and Why. And in these books, Kim really details for the lay person, like not only, it's not so much like reciting what's in the Constitution and breaking it down from a legal perspective, but it's understanding the different things between what's political, what's policy, what some of the framers had in mind when they wrote certain things, how they didn't account for certain things when they wrote this, eons ago. So I highly recommend the book. And we invited Kim on the show today because there are so many different things, like I mentioned, going on in the news and politics space that we wanted to, get her, not only her take on, but, leverage her background and experience, especially on the legal side of things. Nick, I know you've seen a lot of Kim's work in the past. And recently, too, she was just recently on MSNBC on Velshi's show in the morning. So your thoughts on Kim and also what's going around the news and politics space today?
Yeah, I think she provides a really important service right now. Mike, you and I talk often about civics education. I mean, we talk about education a lot. Obviously, that's part of my background and, what I like to bring to the show. But, something that really is missing in classrooms is meaningfully understanding the way our legal system works, and not just the legal system, but laws. And we've had this conversation with Ellie Honig. We've had this with, a variety of other guests in one form or another. Sabrina recently, right? When we talk about legislation, and at that time it was about immigration. What Professor Wehle brings, though, is this understanding of like, why is it important and how do you actually access the Constitution, from the standpoint of being an engaged and informed citizen. So she's doing really important stuff that from an education standpoint, we need to bring back in the classrooms, but that it's coming from her just really across platforms. Mike, you mentioned 3 or 4 different outlets where you see the same person. That's really important. And we're talking also today about, these books that she's putting out too. So even in the written word, you have access to understanding from a law professor's standpoint, but being able to bring it down to someone who's not a lawyer like you and I, the importance of these things and how to be an engaged citizen. So I'm so for this. Like I said, so many guests come on that you and I just sort of get pumped throughout the day, throughout the week, getting ready for. Today especially is important to me because when we look at the average age of voters, and when we look at these previous election cycles and, where are the 18 to 25 year olds? When does that opportunity for them continue to stand up? We saw a greater presence in the 2020 election, but it's still not enough. And these systems are built by, for lack of a better phrase, old people. And they're going to continue to stay the way they are. You and I know one particular person right now in West Virginia that hangs the balance of government and law in this country. Is asinine. we all need to do better. We need to understand better. I think that's what Professor Wehle brings to us.
Yeah, no, and that's really well said about obviously Senator Joe Manchin and all the news that's going around him because she wrote a piece as well on the Bulwark about that. But yeah, a couple of things that I like about Kim. First off, she has a program on YouTube and it's available across digital platforms too on social called Simple Politics, kind of in line with what we're doing. The difference is, years of being an assistant U.S. attorney, she can give another perspective on the legalities behind certain things. But it's really understanding things at a fundamental level, right? We don't want to throw out so many big words that we lose the audience. How do we make it simpler? She did an episode about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She's done an episode recently on COVID with a renowned doctor. So like things like that are kind of in our wheelhouse and things that we like to do from an informative and educational standpoint. The other thing, like I mentioned, the two books I think are fantastic because, it's the word Constitution gets thrown around way too much, for everything, freedoms, liberties. You see it from right and left when they're making arguments about what the framers intended, as if any of them were around back then. And there's so much to that people don't really understand what's in the Constitution, how the Bill of Rights came about, like things like that I think she kind of breaks down in her books. And then the other thing is she's been really obviously advocating, as have a lot of people, and justifiably so, with all the legislation that's being passed to make voting harder. We've had Jessica Coggins on from the Texas Signal talking about the legislation in Texas, obviously, and we've had other people on the program talking about some of this, voter rights issues that are happening in specifically the Southeast states, Georgia, Florida, Texas, that
I
are.
wonder why.
Yeah, there's there's a commonality there. I can't put my finger on it, but
I'm just totally drawn a blank on this.
Hey, and that's why Kim's going to come on the program today to really, because she has done some fantastic work on this. But really, I think at the root is, okay, so now these laws get passed at these states. What can be done legally to challenge some of these things? Does it have to come from the federal level? And those are things that I think people, you and I, lay people that listen, watch this show, they don't understand. What can we do next? And that's why we're going to have Kim on the program to break all of that down. So we're super excited that she was able to join us today. All right, like we introduced at the top, I'm a big fan of this guest, interest of full disclosure. I mentioned this before, started seeing her everywhere, and I was like, I need to speak with her. She is a professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. You've seen her as a frequent contributor on the different network shows from CNN, MSNBC, CBS News. She's also a writer for The Atlantic, thebulwark.com, The Hill, Political, a recent article that just came out. And she has two fantastic books out there in the marketplace that I just mentioned earlier, specifically on why voting matters and how to read the Constitution and why. And that is Kim Wehle. Kim, Mike Leon, Nick Savary, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thank you for having me. So happy to be here.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on. No joke. I was reading your article earlier today, specifically about the lawsuit involving Representative Eric Swalwell and what that could shape out for Donald Trump and his legal fate. I wanted to get into that article, if you didn't mind, for a second, because there was something that you wrote towards the end of the article. If there's a question, if this were to reach the U.S. Supreme Court, that we wouldn't know how the Supreme Court would rule on this, and it could lead to future insurrections that could become commonplace in America. Take our audience a little bit through the article and the piece and what the civil suit is alleging in terms of President Trump's involvement in January 6th.
Yeah, well, that's a big question that actually has multiple levels in terms of answering. So I might get a little broader than even the article. But the article essentially is about a lawsuit that was filed by, as you mentioned, by Representative Swalwell in federal court here in Washington, basically seeking damages and an injunction against the president, against Rudy Giuliani, and others to stop future speeches that could prompt insurrection. So they want the court, as a civil matter, Joe Schmendrick sues Jane Doe, that kind of private civil action. They want Donald Trump to basically be banned from doing that in the future. And the reason that I think this suit came about is because the other mechanisms for holding presidents accountable to the people have failed. The primary one is impeachment, of course. And we saw impeachment fail twice. Many people thought the first impeachment around the quid pro quo call to the Ukrainian president to announce an investigation into Joe Biden. Some people thought that was a bit petty, but it's really hard to watch the footage of January 6th. 5 people dead, the halls of Congress trashed, the entire US Congress sitting there and all of their staffers running for their lives, calling their loved ones. It was a really serious, horrific event. It's hard to see that and say, listen, there should be no accountability. Harry Truman, the buck stops there. The buck should stop with the president. And the Republican Congress refused to convict him on the theory that, well, he's no longer a sitting president. If you look back a few weeks, they were also not interested or in support of any action while he was president. So it's head you win, tails you lose type of, or I lose, so to speak. So what we've seen is essentially under this last president, the guardrails of the democracy in terms of making sure presidents don't act like kings fall apart. The Justice Department has a long-standing internal policy memo. It's kind of like an employee manual that says, you know what, don't prosecute sitting presidents. That goes back to Richard Nixon. So you can't use the criminal justice system against a sitting president. We saw not just the insurrection acquittal, but we saw the first impeachment. Remember, one of the claims was, you know what, you've completely blown off every congressional subpoena. Congress said, no problem, we're going to acquit you on that, which sets a precedent that Congress basically has no power over the president anymore. So the reason I put that last line in there is I really think this civil line of inquiry, particularly given that Republicans in the Congress refused to vote up or authorize a nonpartisan commission to get to the bottom of January 6th. Democrats caved on all their requirements, so it was tailor-made to how the Republicans want it. They wouldn't do that either. So it kind of is like, what's left? What's left is a civil lawsuit. There are a lot of problems with that lawsuit, barriers that Eric Swalwell would have to to overcome. But the problem is, if the Supreme Court were to say, and there are good reasons to say, listen, you can't sue presidents over stuff like that, then we're really left with unlimited power in the U.S. presidency. And maybe, there are listeners out there who supported Donald Trump. That's, I respect that. The issue, though, is if you change the job description and say anything goes, one day there'll be someone you don't like, and then it's too late to turn that around. And I've been sort of ringing this bell for 4 years now, and I'm sure we'll get into voting and elections, but I think things are even bleaker than they were prior to the 2020 election when it comes to the electoral system and voting. And I said on Ali Velshi on Saturday, MSNBC, we are really one election cycle away from the end of American democracy as we know it. It's been this systematic dismantling of government by we the people, and it might just be that we need to lose it to realize how precious it is.
I'm all for doom and gloom. And just to be real about it, because I think that's what is on the table, and Mike knows this about me. I tend to sort of think in those terms too. But Professor Wehle, is it really a matter, as you're articulating sort of those points a moment ago, is it really a matter of just Congress then taking action, like being able to put those protections in place? Again, this is a matter that ultimately the Supreme Court could get involved in, but if there are certain laws passed that can be able to undo, like you said, the memo within the Justice Department, is a matter of just Congress actually potentially doing its job as one of our three branches.
Nick, no, I appreciate that comment and the question. I don't like being the harbinger of gloom and doom, but the way I see this is, you're in a hospital and there's triage, someone has a broken ankle, someone is bleeding out. American democracy is bleeding out, and I have 4 children. And, the writing's on the wall, and education is number one. So that's why this kind of a podcast is so critical, because pretty much most people, when I tell this scenario, are stunned, shocked, can't believe it. And, nobody likes to say, gosh, if I only knew, if I had only done something differently. So now's the time. To answer the other question about what can happen, absolutely, Congress needs to act. This is why there's been so much discussion around West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, because he is this moderate Democrat that is essentially refusing to budge on the voting, the For the People Act, which would fix a lot of the voting problems in this country, and also on the filibuster. Now, so for viewers at may or may not, or listeners that may or may not know this, the filibuster is a procedural relic that essentially allows the minority party to veto any legislation, requires 10 Republicans to sign on, and they're just saying no. So there's a lot of pressure to get rid of that. So some of what we're talking about can happen. Without that, Congress can't do anything. But I'll tell you, and this is a bit of a longer explanation we can get into, I have a piece that's out today in the Hill that makes the argument that the number one thing I think that needs to happen, the real hemorrhaging, the real threat, is not even pending yet in Congress, and that would be amendments to an old statute from, I think it's 1887, called the Electoral Count Act. And that statute is what governs how the states and the United States Congress count votes for the Electoral College. So go right back to January 6th. If we don't want to see another hot mess like that, the Electoral Count Act needs to be amended to say, states, you cannot ignore the popular vote. Right now, it allows legislatures to say, meh, we're going to give it to our choice. We're going to give it to the politician of choice and ignore the will of the people. It also allows, on January 6th, the U.S. Congress to say, meh, even if it gets past the Electoral College certifications in the states, we're going to ignore that, and we're going to anoint, say, a Republican for president, even if Joe Biden wins the Electoral College. That is really the most crucial issue right now, because, of course, it doesn't take a constitutional scholar to understand. If that happens, it's no longer government by we the people, because our votes will have gotten thrown out, ignored, canceled. Then it becomes government by we the powerful. That's a completely different system of government. And given what happened on January 6th, given what's happening across the country on voting rights, and given that the Republican Party is adhering to the big lie, the notion that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president, all the stage is being set for Republican legislatures to take the vote from the popular will and give it the Electoral College votes to someone else. And if that fails, the stage is being set for the United States Congress to take the Electoral College vote away from the states and pick their choice of president. So my view is that every American, frankly, needs to vote members of Congress at the midterms into office, or keep them in office, people who are not adhering to the big lie. And right now, that's primarily Democrats. That, to me, is the linchpin for saving democracy this next cycle. And I know it's scary to hear, but it'd be scarier if we're the Handmaid's Tale in a few years. I'll be honest.
And we're not that far off. The
We're
follow to that question, to that point, though, if I remember reading correctly, some individual states are starting to have measures in place that say that, if the vote goes, like if the popular vote is respected in terms of where the electoral votes go to. Am I correct in that? Like individual states to start putting in measures in support of this?
That is possible. I'll be, in all honesty, Nick, I've been paying closer attention to the states that are going the other direction. My guess is if the states are going in a direction to adhere to the popular vote, they're probably more likely blue states, because they're not involved in this disintegration of democracy. The flip side of that is Georgia, for example. And there are a handful of other states with proposed legislation. But if you recall, Donald Trump, he's under criminal investigation in Georgia for making a phone call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia when the popular vote went for Joe Biden, saying, find enough votes to give it to me. So one of the elements of the new voting package that did pass in Georgia is to take that power away from Brad Raffensperger, whoever's in that seat, and give it to the legislature. So when that call comes, in theory, in the future, politicians will say, no problem, we'll give you Georgia, even though the popular vote went to somebody else. So I'm more worried about the states in the breach, because that is so unprecedented. It's not even, when I say unprecedented, of course, what we saw prior to the Voting Rights Act in 1960s with lynching of people who voted, of people of color. We've had a very dark history. But since then, since 1965, I don't know that we've seen, maybe in 2011, but I don't think we've seen an assault on the right to vote as robust as we're seeing right now.
Well, you fed right into it because I wanted to ask you about the states, specifically Georgia, Florida, Texas. We've had a couple people on from the different states to talk about the individual laws that are being passed and the measures that are being taken to restrict access to voting, mail-in voting. So I want to ask you a two-part question, which is the worst thing to do as a journalist.
And yeah, he's going to do it anyway.
Yeah, I'm going to do it anyway. The first
I'm
part,
a lawyer, I can handle it. It's okay.
right. The first part is which one is the most egregious? I think to people on the surface, they see the chyron at the bottom of CNN, MSNBC, and it's all bad, right? So which one is really infringing upon voters' rights that you think is the most egregious of all of them? I know they're all bad, but of all of them, and if you could take us into what is being passed in those states, and then the flip side of it is, so what do we do now? These get passed at the state level. Do we just wait for the federal level to pass something? HR 1 is like the Vote for the People Act. Like, what is it that can be done post this?
Okay, so you've named, I think, the baddest actors, at least on the stage right now, and that would be Texas and Georgia. Texas, experts say, is now the hardest state in the country in which to vote, and the avalanche of changes in these states are too overwhelming to kind of pick apart state by state, but I want to highlight a few things that are particularly egregious. We heard, many people heard in Georgia how there's now a penalty for bringing food and water to people who are standing in line to vote. But in my mind, there's a couple other things that are potentially even worse in various states across the country. I mean, Texas is difficult because just a lot of pulling back on, mobile voting, early voting, voting by mail, ID requirements for mail-in voting, ID requirements for in-person voting. But this is in all kinds of states. But the two things that are particularly problematic, in addition to, as I said, taking election administration away from career officials and giving it to politicians. One is that states across the country in various places are empowering so-called poll watchers to essentially bully voters and to bully election officials. And the flip side of that, when I say that, and we saw this in Pennsylvania, these lawsuits about, do you have to be 6 feet or 10 feet? There was an injunction in place in the early 80s against the Republican Party, a federal injunction that was renewed, but that expired a few years ago because this is an old trick, right? But the other thing about these empowering poll workers to bully is these laws are also precluding election officials from doing anything about it. So say, you've got people voting or you have someone counting ballots and there's a heckler screaming over their shoulder. The laws are banning these people who are working these elections from doing it, be against the law to stop that person so that you could do your job. And the other part of that is some of these states are making it a crime or imposing up to a $25,000 penalty on election workers for making ministerial mistakes. If they, for example, and I can't keep track of which state is which because again, it's so overwhelming, but their proposal, at least one proposal, if an election official were to send a mail-in ballot to someone without a specific request in that election, they could be subject to a criminal penalty. If they didn't close a drop box by a certain date and time, sharp, impose criminal penalty or a massive civil fine. Now, guys, I mean, one of the big problems with the big lie is that this election in a pandemic was administered by thousands and thousands of regular people, our neighbors, our friends, our teachers, our colleagues, our moms, our dads, our grandmas, our grandpas. These are not fraudsters. These are people who work really hard and they do it because they care about democracy and they care about their communities. A lot of them have gotten harassed. There are reports of bodyguards the last round because people are so angry about the fraud. And now you're going to be susceptible to criminal penalties for just doing your job and making mistakes like we all do. Who's going to show up for these things? I mean, it's really just making voting close to impossible. Now, what can we do about it? Well, the first thing is people need to hear that voting is not just important at the federal level, it's really important at the state and local level. The people that are in charge of how your elections are run are your state and local officials. If you don't like how they're dealing with these voting laws, you need to vote out of office your state legislatures, the state legislators, the state senators, and the state members of whatever the House of Representatives or the Commonwealth are named different things. That's absolutely vital. There is, as you mentioned, Mike, two pieces of legislation that are pending the United States Congress. Joe Manchin, I mentioned him earlier, has said, I don't like H.R. 1. H.R. 1, some people criticize it because it tries to do too much, but it does do things like mandatory federal requirement that in federal elections, that automatic voter registration, that you can register on the day, that you can vote by mail. These things that just make life easy for the rest of us in the wake of no evidence of fraud. So that would help. That doesn't address the Electoral Count Act. H.R. 4 is one that Joe Manchin said he would support. This is a minor thing. This takes a bit of an explanation, but Mitch McConnell came out today and said he doesn't support it. H.R. 4 is literally putting back in the Voting Rights Act something the Supreme Court killed in 2013. The Voting Rights Act was put into place to basically implement the civil rights amendments to the U.S. Constitution, including the 15th Amendment, which gave men of color, not women, but men of color, the right to vote. But then legislatures got cute, passed all these things that made it impossible to vote anyway. You've got to cite the Declaration of Independence. You've got to pay a big tax. Congress got together with Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King with his support and passed the Voting Rights Act and said, you know what, if you're a bad actor state and you've done this baloney in the past, you need to run your stuff by the Justice Department. You need to get the blessing of the Justice Department. Supreme Court killed that in 2013, 5-4 decision authored by Chief Justice Roberts. H.R. 4, they said, you know what, Congress, we want an update to that statute. Sent them back to the drawing board. H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, would just do that. Put the Justice Department back, put the cop back on the block. So that is really, really important. Those two pieces are critical, but again, they don't address the Electoral Count Act. But for every listener, I mean, voting is your power. Voting is your seat at the table.
Speaking of Senator Manchin, it seems like we've arrived at a place where, and no disrespect to the state of West Virginia, but just from a numbers standpoint, from a percentage of population versus, the aggregate, like the rest of the country, Professor, have we landed in a place where such a small percentage of people through their elected official hold so much sway that really seems to hold so much up?
So one is what's in the actual Constitution itself that's really hard to change. That is 2 senators per state. Okay. And so California has the same number of senators as North Dakota. So the people in North Dakota, their vote matters a lot more than the people in California. Any individual person, your vote is massively diluted by dozens and dozens of exponents. I can't remember the statistic, but it's double digits. So that's a problem. The only way to change that would be to actually amend the Constitution. Really hard to do. You need 2/3 of the majorities of the House and the Senate at the federal level, and 3/4 of all the states' legislature. So that's not going to happen. Disproportionate Senate is a problem. However, there could be term limits for senators that would turn things over more and minimize kind of that entrenched notion that I just don't care because I'm here. Joe Manchin just won re-election. He's there for 6 more years. Once people are in office, it's harder to get them out. But Senate is kind of stuck. As is the majority rule in the Constitution for passing legislation, 51. And I mentioned the filibuster. Okay, so Joe Manchin he's the holdup. The reason they're courting him is because it requires, filibuster was removed for federal judges. They want his vote. Biden wants his vote for his federal judges, that 50th vote, and then Kamala Harris would be 51. So that 50% or that 50, bare majority is in the Constitution. Filibuster is not, but it would require Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, 2 Democrats who have said they don't want to tinker with the filibuster. They have to come on board. The House of Representatives is different. By statute, okay, Congress passed a statute in the 40s, 435. members of the House of Representatives. We talk about gerrymandering. We talk about red and blue districts that can't move. Gerrymandering is nowhere in the Constitution. That could be amended. That's part of H.R. 1 to have a commission fix gerrymandering. And Congress could pass a statute saying, you know what, we need 1,000 members of Congress. That's going to bring more people into the pie. That's just going to have more voices. And right now we're so polarized and so party oriented that our members of Congress are caring about their professional survival more than representing their constituencies. And that's really a problem, as is money in politics. So I could talk a lot about that. I don't, we started the show with kind of being gloom and doom about democracy, but I still think it's, we could have a parliamentary system. Other parts of the world have different kinds, and I'm not sure that our system is the best. But it's lasted much longer than the framers thought it would last, and it's what's the beauty of the Constitution is it is adaptable, right? And as much, I also really have problems with people who claim the Constitution is a black and white document, the originalists or textualists, because it has adapted. We've seen it adapt. We saw it adapt from slavery to Jim Crow to Black Lives Matter, which is still an issue today, but it's not, I was just watching a program about how many soldiers of color came back from World War II. 900,000 put their lives at risk in World War II to defend international democracy, to come home to be lynched because it was too proud to wear a uniform if you were a black man. I mean, we've really come so far, but not. So I want to be optimistic, but it really is one of these things. You hold your kid's hand when you cross the street because you just never know. This is the time, friends, that you have to just take every precaution to protect democracy, and that means in this moment, the triage is keep Democrats in control of both houses of Congress, which, a lot of pundits in Washington think is not going to happen the next round.
Professor Wehle, I want to segue into your two fantastic books, like I mentioned, especially I was reading recently How to Read the Constitution and Why, and the other book, and What You Need to Know about Voting and Why. I love the hows and the whys. The buzzword of Constitution gets thrown around on right, left, center, Constitution this, Constitution that. And you wrote this fantastic book, right? And what I wanted to ask you was, what do you find to be the most frustrating thing when the Constitution and the legal system are discussed in the media? Just in the context of now that the word Constitution is a buzzword now for people. So what do you find to be the most frustrating thing that people are not understanding? Is it something that you touch upon in the book?
Oh, yes. It's why I wrote the book. So, I never planned to be in media at all. This was never something I thought I could do, let alone wanted to do or have an opportunity to do. And it was 4 years ago reading a New York Times piece in which somebody said the pardon power is absolute. There are no limits on the pardon power. That's an overstatement. There aren't any, really, almost any, maybe the 13th Amendment ban on slavery, but you could make arguments that there's forms of slavery that still exist in America that are legal, but nothing in the Constitution is that black and white. And I would say, Mike, that's one of the biggest myths. And it's been peddled also by our judiciary, our candidates for the Supreme Court. We heard Amy Coney Barrett say, I read the plain language, I stick to the text. No. I mean, it's an old document. It's really short. I just did a piece today in the Bulwark on the Second Amendment. I've gotten some people mad about that. And great example. People think the Second Amendment sacrosanct, can't do any, can't even limit it in any way, or that's some people's belief. It talks about militias and it talks about the right to bear arms, but it doesn't say how those pieces fit together. The court used to say it was limited to militias and then switched in 2008 and said that actually gives an individual right. There you have the United States Supreme Court historically interpreting it in two ways. It's like a poem. It's like a biblical text. It gets interpreted. And I think there's an instinct in the media to have easy answers and to want to get to the bottom line. And these are complex. You can see in this conversation. You need to understand some of the foundation of the house before you put the roof on, or the finishing touches on it. And that takes some time and that takes some education. So what my book tries to do is teach people how to think about the Constitution themselves So they could draw these conclusions on their own and they don't have to listen to me and other pundits in 30 seconds on CNN and tell them what to believe. And the why part is there is if you understand the rationale behind the Constitution, like any law, it makes more sense to you, and then you can maybe noodle through it on your own. For example, the example I use for my students is, we have 65 miles an hour here to Baltimore. I live in Washington. That's very easy to implement, but sometimes it's too fast in a snowstorm. You could switch it to drive safely. That's the kind of thing. Okay, it's very subjective. You're gonna have to have evidence. It's gonna be really difficult. But both laws are really about making it safe for people to drive at the same time it's easy to administer. That's what's called a policy argument. So my book kind of breaks down how to think about the Constitution in common sense terms. It's really a job description for government. The other thing is that it's not a monarchy. So one thing, you could be an originalist or a living constitutionalist or debate how to read the Constitution. One thing is for sure, people fought and died to get rid of an unlimited monarchy where what the king says goes and the people have no say in it. And I think that's where you keep your eye on the ball. We need to come together as we the people and adhere to the roadmap for our democracy and not keep fighting about who's wearing, if it's a blue colored shirt or a red colored cop uniform, right? Because if the whole bridge goes down of the Constitution, and I say this in my book, we all go down. It doesn't matter. And we've seen this historically in the globe, across the globe. People don't understand. If we no longer have a say in our government, the rights that you and I take for granted are gone because they become arbitrary. I don't like someone with blue eyes. We're going to put you in jail. I don't like that point of view. We're going to audit you and take over your property. Whatever it is, people will do whatever they can do if they have the power. That's exactly why the framers broke up the power of our government into 3 different branches so that it's not accumulated in one place, because they understood it's human nature to abuse power.
You mentioned, we were transitioning from media to education. Funny enough, Mike's background's in media, mine's in education. You're a law professor. What kind of unpacking do you find yourself often doing, when students come into your classroom? Like, what are some of the assertions that people have or students have about our legal system, the Constitution? Like, what trends do you notice that you have to do a lot of job of sort of just breaking apart and unpacking, as the learning begins, for the work that you do?
Yeah, so there's a study out of the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania that's gone out and done it every year, every few years, but pretty consistently, only a third of Americans can name the 3 branches of government: judicial, executive, and legislative. Most, a significant number can't name a single right protected by the First Amendment. There was a study done a few years ago of recent college grads, and a shocking percentage thought Judge Judy, the TV star, was on the U.S. Supreme Court. So civic education is a crisis in this country. In the time of Lincoln, people could recite the Constitution. If you read the Gettysburg Address, it's quite complicated. It's dense. It's very nuanced. It's a lot of packed in there, and people who listened to Lincoln understood it because a lot of them understood this stuff. Our citizenry, unless frankly you are an immigrant who had to take a test of citizenry, we don't understand this stuff. So to answer your question, Mike, I break everything down. I teach them, and this is in my book too, what's the difference between a statute and a case decided by a court? What's the difference between a civil trial and a criminal trial? People, if it's a criminal trial, you can go to jail. The other big thing is just what I was discussing with Mike, that they all want answers. What do you want on the exam, Professor Wehle? It's like, no, I want you to think through the nuances of the problem, weigh both sides of the issue, gather all of the facts that are relevant, gather the standards, and then argue both sides. Because if you are tunnel vision, you're going to get killed in court because the other side's going to point something out that you forgot. So there's something really magical about legal thinking. And actually, my 3rd book comes out February 1st with Harper, and it's called How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, Everyday Guide to something guide to everyday dilemmas, but it's basically how to think like a lawyer. And I break this down because the instinct more and more in the 16 years I've been teaching is memorize, regurgitate, memorize, regurgitate. The independent thinking is very hard to get them, many of these students, to be willing to do. They want an answer. And that's this polarized black and white thinking we're in. I'm on team red, I'm on team blue. I'm sticking with my team. I don't care what the evidence is. I don't care who gets hurt. That's my team. And it's a very corrosive, unproductive way of thinking. It helps in a pinch, in a crisis. You know, if you've got to make a life and death decision, that kind of thinking is very valuable, but not when it comes to complex policy issues facing this country.
You know, and it's a perfect transition. I find myself saying this a lot on the show because Nick and I started this podcast to be informational, educational, and not just going to get it from us, but you're going to get it from people like you. We've had Ellie Honig on the show, Michael Eric Dyson, Olivia Troy, different people that have worked not only in news and politics. And you started recently a show called Simple Politics that you can check out on YouTube. But tell us a little bit about Simple Politics, because you've had a few different episodes about some intricate topics, specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you've really broken it down for the layperson. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about that show and the goals that you aim to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is on Instagram, and when I can, I do it live. But then the full version does go on YouTube, called Simple Politics. And the idea was, after doing hundreds of TV interviews, podcasts, they tend to be better, but a lot of NPR, short radio hits, I found myself wanting to not just go deeper, but to start from the beginning and break everything down. If you're a newbie to this topic, let's just start from the basics and then build our way up to the sophistication. Because I found, and maybe this is partly the motivation for you all too, I think people are almost embarrassed sometimes that they don't know some of these basic civics, or say Israel Palestine. I mean, I didn't know a lot about it, so I invited an expert, and I just didn't have the time to do all the deep dive research and have someone really ask the question so that I can get a surgical answer and not read 15 articles and still not see how the dots connected. So the goal of the show is to get somebody on that I know how to ask the questions as a law professor and done a little bit of background, to connect the dots, dot to dot to dot. So as you indicate, I've got an expert on China on there, Bonnie Glazer. If you want to know, why are we so worried about China? Why should Americans care? Lots of legal stuff, of course. Great show on poverty in America, breaking down tremendous myths, and how really capitalists, big corporations, should get behind a hike in the minimum wage, using your logical mind to see a different point of view. And I just do it because it's fun, frankly, and I get to meet really interesting people and learn a ton.
The reason we started this show, in all seriousness, and we conceptualized it back in the summer, and I've made numerous points about this on the show, but I started traveling in the Southeast, and during, COVID and the George Floyd and the civil unrest, and I found a lot of, that's your fact, that's your fact. That's our fact. It's not my fact. It's not your fact. If we can't meet at the sky's blue and the sun is yellow, then this conversation cannot continue. But we need to understand also, I guess there's the two parts of it, is like, do we need to argue with that person that says the sky is orange? Do we need to bring them back into the sun is yellow and the sky is blue? That's a different topic altogether, but I truly appreciate what it is that you're doing on Simple Politics. And like I said, it's something that we kind of emulate on this show. So thank you so much for coming on the program today, Professor Wehle. All the best and continued success to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I really, really enjoyed it. And I appreciate the work that you're doing too. I hope you have a wide audience to listen to this, because it's really important to get the word out.
That was Professor Kim Wehle, like I mentioned, University of Baltimore School of Law. If you're a student there, you've got a great professor.
You're getting your money's worth, people.
That's right. She is the author of those fantastic books, like I mentioned, How to Read the Constitution and Why, because that's the important part. Yeah, anybody can read it. It's why, and what you need to know about voting, and why. Those books are available wherever books are sold. You can check out all her articles online at thebulwark.com, at Politico, at The Hill, and you can catch her around the circuit, CNN, MSNBC, CBS News. She's been pretty much everywhere. Nick, Professor Wehle, we were talking about it off air about the gloom and doom scenarios, but I think it is, if you feel that way and you are teaching young minds of tomorrow about things that not only happen in the past, things that have happened from a legal perspective, current day, like then it is incumbent upon somebody to say, hey, man, this stuff is wrong. This is what's going to impact not me, not my kid, maybe my kid's kid, things like that. So I thought her takes on a lot of this stuff, and it's really not her takes because it's wrapped around factual evidence of things that are happening right now in the news, the legal cycle and stuff like that. What'd you make of Professor Wehle and some of the stuff that she discussed, the Voting Rights Act? There's so much to digest there.
Dude, I feel validated. I mean, I've been saying this shit to you for years and to other friends of mine about, like, we're in a crisis. Like, this is actually happening. January 6th, again, it was led by just a parade of morons, but the next time you have to assume people are going to do that right. And there is a system right now in place in courts. Like, we're not having the conversation enough to say, this is out of control. Like, there has to be legal protections. And, I think Professor Wehle really gives just validation to all of that. What she brings up though is from these very different spaces, and her just amazing experience. It's like really just meaningfully how to really understand this and understand really what the stakes are. And I can't recommend enough her books. I think, we've talked often, you and I offline, and sometimes on this show too, about civic engagement. And she spoke a lot about this too. Like, we've all got to be, as citizens in this country, like, we got to recognize that elections matter up and down. She said that on the show, talking about it's not just the federal election. It's not every 4 years you show up and vote for president.
That's right.
But who influences the way voting works in your congressional district? Like when you go to wherever you go to vote, and hopefully where that is.
Right.
Who sort of sets the table for how that system works. So anyway, she hits on all of it. That was an awesome conversation.
You're right. It's very important. I think one of the things I like and admire about her is this fundamental understanding. It's the basis for our show, right? People lack a fundamental understanding of something. And then it gets wrapped around in this, well, that is your fact. That's your fact. People can't differentiate between fact and opinion. And that's why I love the concept of simple politics. You can check it out, like she mentioned, across her Instagram and social platforms, and sometimes on YouTube. You can check out her articles online, like I mentioned, and check out the Patreon portion where she came on to really tell us about how do we get people more civically engaged? Is it something that we can do similar to what they're doing with the vaccine and trying to bribe people to understand stuff? So I thought she'd give a fantastic answer on that. Head to Patreon, type in Can We Please Talk Podcast, or go to our show notes page. And all you can do is click on the link right there. Become a Patreon subscriber to listen to all of that.
Bagel and coffee in New York City, people. That's all. It's all costs. Seriously. Get the good stuff. Get behind the wall, people.
It's a cup of coffee and a bagel, Nick. You forget about the bagel part.
I said that. I said a bagel and a cup of coffee.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, then I apologize. And also, by the way, it's deli coffee and a bagel, too. So you don't really got to go to an actual bagel spot. So head on over to the Patreon part, because that's a little bit cheaper for people. But you want to stay on the freemium side, YouTube, Nick's pointing down, smashing the subscribe button, audio platforms, you know them by now, Apple, Spotify, Google, all the majors. Check out our show. Email us, folks. Please email us. Can we please talk podcast at yahoo.com. If you want to talk about tonight's topic, you've got something you want to get off your chest about any of the episodes, you've got recommendations for us, please hit us up and follow us on social as well, IG and TikTok at Can We Please Talk Podcast, and on Twitter at Can We Please Talk. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
I'm grateful to be doing this show with amazing people like him and Mike. I'm Nick Zverry.
Oh, that is great. You know what? That is a very kumbaya moment. Well done by you, sir.
Clip that, man.
No, I'm not going to clip it. I'm going to keep it. It's a kumbaya moment.
I mean, clip it like the...
clip it like clip it.
Like,
okay,
not leave it on the cutting room floor,
I got you. Have a good one, everybody.
Later.